Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Sean Burke. I'm the director of the AJAX Control Toolkit at Microsoft. I want to thank you guys for coming today. Some really great stuff shown in the keynote yesterday, so this is kind of the retro hour of this talk. We're going all the way back to 2006 and talking about AJAX and the Toolkit, which is still a great story and works really well with the Silverlight story. So talk about how to integrate AJAX into your project today. The Toolkit is a community-developed project at Microsoft, started about a year ago, actually kind of right around the time of MIX06. And kind of the goals of the Toolkit, at a high level, are to make it really easy for ASP.NET developers to consume AJAX controls on their pages, and at the same time make it really easy for component developers to write AJAX components using the ASP.NET AJAX extensions and framework that we shipped earlier this year. So by kind of addressing these two sides of the problem, we really wanted to kind of accelerate and build the ecosystem around ASP.NET AJAX and really allow people to add some great UI flexibility to their websites without having to learn a lot of JavaScript and without having to do a lot of extra coding. So we're going to talk about how to work that into your toolkit or into your website today. One of the big goals for me and my team for the Toolkit was to really have fun. We started the Toolkit as an open source project. Open source shared source. It's hosted up on Codeplex. So it's been an interesting exercise to kind of break out of the typical Microsoft model and really investigate some new and interesting ways to develop software. So what is the Toolkit? Scott Guthrie told me once that Scott Hanselman, one of the kind of community influentials, had jokingly called our controls cheating because they don't require you to write any client-side JavaScript. And I thought that was actually a pretty good compliment. But basically, the Toolkit is a framework for building and deploying AJAX-enabled components, as well as a pre-built set of controls that you can use and consume in your websites. The Toolkit is a shared source project. We bring together the best of kind of the community process and the Microsoft internal development process to create a model that's kind of new, and we think is really a better way to develop software. What ended up happening was, about a year ago, Scott Guthrie asked me to write a set of components to kind of jumpstart what was called Atlas then at the time development. And what ended up happening was me and my team formed kind of a symbiotic relationship with the ASP.NET AJAX team, where they create the kind of core platform. They focus on extensibility and robustness, performance, and then my team kind of takes on the role of writing the components and the widgets in the UI layer. And it worked out to be this great synergy. We've gotten a lot of excitement. We've gotten well over 250,000 downloads from Codeplex of the Toolkit, so it's been really exciting. One of the things we've done with the Toolkit and Codeplex that's been great is that we can really drive the features in the Toolkit from user feedback. We look a lot at the issue tracker, the bug database that's on Codeplex, and we use the voting system on there heavily to make decisions about what things to address and fix next. So it's been really great to have a really tight development loop. We release about once a month, and it's been fun to kind of do things a little differently. So this is a slide that kind of tries to visualize how the Toolkit fits in with ASP.NET AJAX extensions. So the kind of top side of this graph is the server side, and the bottom side is the client side. So the ASP.NET AJAX Toolkit is both server-side and client-side pieces, and we're community co-developed. Kind of got moved over a little bit there, but in the blue side. On the other side is the value-add CTPs that the ASP.NET AJAX team shipped. And what's happened is that we've taken several of the features from those CTPs that didn't make it into the actual ASP.NET AJAX RTM, and we've moved them into the Toolkit, so this symbiosis happens. And all this is built around the ASP.NET AJAX libraries that were present in the ASP.NET AJAX RTM and now are being moved into the Orcus product. So the Toolkit is basically built on top of two pieces. On the server side, it's built on top of ASP.NET 2.0 and on top of the AJAX server extensions. On the client side, we're built on top of this great, really robust AJAX JavaScript library that ships as part of ASP.NET AJAX. And this is really my favorite part of the AJAX product, is this framework. It allows you to add a lot more structure to your JavaScript, and you're much more productive than kind of the traditional way of sprinkling it throughout your website. On top of that, what we did was we sat down and wrote a set of enabling base classes, kind of an SDK on top of ASP.NET AJAX that really makes it easy focus in on the scenarios of writing components. We're shipping some Visual Studio templates. You can kind of create a new Toolkit project or a new Toolkit component. And then, like I said, we're shipping a fairly large set of components as well that are ready to use in your website. So let's take a quick look at what you get if you download the Toolkit project from Codeplex. So what we have here is the Toolkit project, and the Toolkit project comes with 4 pieces. It's a little small over here, but this is the actual Toolkit itself. These are all the components. These have full source in them for all 34 components, all the base classes, all the infrastructure that does things like resources and globalization and processing on the server and the client side. This entire project is licensed under what's called the Microsoft Permissive License, which is really one of the best shared source licenses out there. The word permissive is key in that license title. You can reuse this code, you can repackage it, you can modify it, you can put it into your product. It's a very open license, and we encourage people to do that. The website also comes with, if you've seen the Toolkit up on the ajax.asp.net website, the Toolkit site that's up there that shows the demo of all the components, which looks just like this, is actually part of the project as well. So one of the kind of simple things we've done is we've integrated samples and documentation on the website. So each component in the Toolkit has a sample page like this that allows you to kind of try out the component hosted either in your project or up on ajax.asp.net. We've got a description, and then we've also got some basic documentation here as well. So we've tried to go the simple route and make it really easy for people to kind of pick stuff up and use these pages as learning to kind of get moving with the Toolkit. We also have a testing harness built in as well, and you can also leverage this from your projects. It turns out testing AJAX code is kind of difficult because you need to test in the context of the JavaScript running in the browser. So things like page refreshes, if you've got testing code in the page posts back for some reason and your testing code is gone. So we have kind of a unique solution to this as well. And so if you build components, you can leverage this framework as well. And here's an example of when we write fixes for the framework. For the Toolkit as well, we kind of run this little test harness page, and here's an example of it running in the browser. It runs in Firefox or Opera or Internet Explorer. And then finally, the Toolkit project also has the templates in here as well. If you want to customize the templates for creating new components, if there's stuff your company always uses, you can also customize these and then build the VSI, which will install the templates into your Visual Studio installation. So that's the project. You can download it from Codeplex. You can either download our released bits. One of the great things about Codeplex is you can download every check-in we make. Like every single check-in, public download, we'll send you a zip file, which is a project just like this that you can use in Visual Studio. So it's very friendly to use. So kind of fundamentals about the Toolkit. The Toolkit cross-browser support. We support everything that the ASP.NET AJAX supports, i.e. 6 and 7 Firefox, Safari on the Mac, as well as Opera. So we have good, robust support. We've worked really hard to work through all these issues, and we've got very few outstanding issues between the browsers. We try to be aggressive about fixing those. Both the Toolkit project and the ASP.NET AJAX team have worked really hard to make this framework play nicely with other frameworks. When we moved from the Atlas kind of previews to the ASP.NET AJAX RTM, we actually changed a bunch of our aliases. If you've ever done any JavaScript programming, little $signs to alias different calls. We found that some of ours were conflicting with some other frameworks out there, and we changed them so that you can use ASP.NET AJAX or the Toolkit in concert with a framework like Scriptaculous or Dojo or something like that. We did want them to play together nicely and not collide. The Toolkit is broken up into a couple different kinds of pieces. There's extenders, there's controls and behaviors, and we'll talk more about what these are in a moment. And as I mentioned, you can get it all up on Codeplex. So using the Toolkit for page development, you can easily enhance existing websites or create new ones. JavaScript skills are not required. And it's easily deployed to the website's bin directory. So you're not waiting for your hoster to kind of install this stuff for you to be able to use it. Just go and drop it in the bin directory, you're good to go. And you can customize the source to your heart's content. So to create an extender, they work just like server-side components you're used to in ASP.NET. You just create a reference to the Toolkit project or to your component, and you say my extender to declare the component. The kind of key property that every extender has is a target control ID. And the target control ID is the control on the page, the ASP.NET control that your extender is extending. So every single one of these, when we do our demos, you're going to see a lot of these. So in this case, you're pointing at some text box on the page. And then you start declaring properties just like you do with regular ASP.NET. You can also create them in code. One of the things we've done is allowed you to work with these in code just like you do other ASP.NET components. So in this case, this is the code that would create the component in the same way the markup did that you just saw. We're going to attach it to a text box and set some properties on it and just add it to the page. It just works. So let's take a look at what it means to actually build out a website that has Toolkit functionality. So what I have here is a very simple, basically a blank website. All it's got in it is some divs, and it's got an update panel. For anybody here that hasn't used ASP.NET AJAX, what an update panel allows you to do is allows you to have postback code within your page that doesn't cause the entire page to refresh. So the update panel gives you kind of AJAX asynchronous postback functionality just as a control. So it's got this content template area here in the middle. So any postbacks happen from within this code, just that part of the page will refresh. So this is where we're starting from, basically from scratch. We've got this text box on here. So what I did in creating this demo is I took the session grid that we get as speakers, and I made it into an XML file, and we're going to use this as our data source. What we're going to write is a little website to kind of browse session information for MIX07. So let's get started. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we get good input from the users. So in ASP.NET, what we would do for our text box is we add something called a required field validator. And what a required field validator does is make sure that there's a value in a text box before you can push OK. So what we're going to add to this is we're going to change the text here to please enter a search. And then we're going to point it at this text box control. Go ahead and run this website, get a good idea what it looks like. Simple website. If I try to hit search now, I get the please enter a search. But that's no fun. Let's make that a little more interesting. So we'll add our first Toolkit component here. And our first Toolkit component is called the validator callout. And we have it here in our toolbox. And here at the bottom. It's called the validator callout extender. And this one's really easy to use. We mentioned that we use a target control ID for all of these. So target control ID equals, we're going to set it to this required field validator. And then one thing we're going to do here to the required field validator is make sure that it knows that it needs to not show its value. So we're going to set display equal to none. Run this. So now what happens when I hit search is I get this nice pop-up here instead of the plain text on the website. So no code, I have a little better experience there. Let's make this a little more interactive. Another component, and this is, I mentioned that we took some components from the Atlas CTPs and moved them into the Toolkit. So another component that's interesting to use here is the autocomplete extender. And what this does is it adds autocomplete functionality to a text box. So again, we're going to set the target control ID to that text box. And we're going to set some more properties on this one. One of the properties we're going to set is the min prefix length. And what this means is this is telling the autocomplete extender how many characters to type in the text box before it starts doing autocompletion. We want to start with the first one just for this demo. And then the way that this component works, it actually calls back to the server via a web service. Oops. So we're going to give it this service method. We're going to call it getCompletionList. So we could specify any web service here, but we're going to actually call back to the page. One of the things that ASP.NET AJAX supports is something called page methods. So instead of having to create a whole another web service class, I can actually call back into a page method directly. So we're going to use that. We're going to call it getCompletionList. So let's add that method to the code behind file for this website. So here's the method here. It's called getCompletionList. It takes a string property of prefix text and a count of how many characters are completed. But what I've done here is I've actually used a little bit of LINQ code. And if you haven't played with LINQ yet, I would highly recommend it. The syntax, when you first see it, is kind of scary, but once you do it once, it makes a lot of sense. It's very similar to SQL queries, but what we're going to do is we're going to load up that XML file I showed you, and we're going to look for all of the sessions that have the title that starts with or that contains the string we type in. So it's just going to do basically a like star.value.star and return that as an array. So let's take a look at that. So we load up now, and we type something like web. And now we start getting auto-completion here. These are all the ones that have the word web in them, or business, a little less there, or Toolkit. So, or Silverlight, for example. Plenty of Silverlight sessions, and I can kind of select through these things here. I can select one of them, and then it'll auto-complete. So we've added some functionality there. Still no JavaScript. Let's continue to make this website more interactive. So what we're going to do next is just going to add a data grid a little farther down on this page. Actually, just go ahead and add a grid view. Where's my data components? Just a plain grid view. Then we're going to go over to code really quickly and add some data binding code for this. Again, we're going to use some LINQ code. We need to add it to the buttons click event. So click equals button 1, click. Let's go ahead and do this as a designer. One of the great features of the Orcus product is this split view where you can actually get the designer view and the code view at the same time. I'm not really using it in this demo all the time because it does slow things down a little bit, and I want to be able to move things along. But for this purpose, we're going to go ahead and use this to define this function. So in the button click code, we're going to go ahead and add some more LINQ code. I'm going to post this whole demo up on my blog immediately after the talk, so you can look this more. But what this is basically code is doing is the same thing as the prior code, but we're going to return a list of objects this time. And there's another great piece of functionality in C# 3.0 called anonymous types, which means I can create a type just based on its field values, and we don't have to create a new type. We don't have to do a constructor. We can just do this great, quick method here. It's very, very useful. So we're just going to bind up the grid view to that data. So we got that. Go ahead and run this. So what we're going to get now is we're just going to get a grid view that has all the data that we selected. So we'll type silver, hit search. Now we get a plain grid view. So let's make this a better experience for our users. So one of the things I've done here is I have a grid view that has some better formatting in it and some column definitions. So let's go ahead and push that in. So what this is I've added a style to this grid view. So that's what all this stuff is up here at the top. I've turned auto-generate columns to false because I'm going to specify the columns. And down here is kind of my column definition. So I'm just going to show a few less fields on the data grid so we have a little more room to work with. So, oops. Try spelling it right. There we go. So now we have a details button here. So let's add in some functionality behind that details button. We have an extender that's very popular called the modal pop-up extender. And what this does is it allows you to easily show a modal dialog on your web page. So the first thing that you do to use this extender is you just add some markup to define how you want the pop-up to look. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to have a panel. It's this component here. And then we're just going to show some of the details about the talk in the panel as well. And then we're going to use that as our pop-up. Down here at the bottom of the panel, we have an OK button. We're going to use that to close the panel. So let's go ahead and wire up the extender. Again, this is called the modal pop-up extender. It's down here in the M's. So this guy has quite a bit of functionality to it. We're just going to use the basics here. So again, we do target control ID. And in this case, we actually point this at the button that's going to launch the component. So in this case, it's link button 1. That was the button that said, or the link that said details. We also want to specify that the server control that we want to pop up when the button gets clicked, and that's panel 1. So we call that pop-up control ID. Oops. It's panel 1. And then we want to specify which item we want to have close the, which button or link we want to have to close the panel, and that's actually link button 2 right here, so it's OK control ID. You can also specify a cancel. Link button 2. Now we want to show a nice background, so there's another property called background CSS class. We've got some CSS already applied here called modal BG, and you'll see in a second what this does, but this allows you to define what the background looks like behind the modal pop-up. And then finally, we've got a nice effect called drop shadow. We're going to show that as well. Set that to true. So overlight again. So notice how you were able to see those for a second. And that's a common problem that people run into, and we're going to show you how to fix that in a second. So let's actually fix that before we show the functionality. The problem was that we didn't tell the web browser that we don't want that panel to be shown to begin with. So what ended up happening was the web browser showed up, and the client-side code tried to hide it. But in that period of time when the web browser was first loading, all those panels showed before the client-side code was running to hide them. So let's go ahead and fix that. It's really easy to fix. So we just go up here to our panel, and we just add a little style here, equals display none. If you've done any website development at all, you start to learn quickly how useful display none is, and this will hide those components until we're ready to use them. The modal pop-up extender, we'll use web this time, is aware of display none, and it'll turn it off. So now I get this effect here. Again, no code, so I can show a little more information to the user. In a nice format. We get the background. Notice I can't click on the links behind it. You have to trust me, I'm trying to click. We actually catch those. And then when I hit this OK button, I go back to the page. So nice effect there without having to do much coding at all. So if we didn't want to use a grid view, we actually have a different piece of UI that we can use. And I'll just add it below the grid view, or we'll add it above the grid view. Something called the accordion control, and this is another one of our kind of users' favorites as well. So a lot of this code is very similar to what we use just in the grid view. So this accordion control is a data-bound component. Move into view here. We're going to display something very similar to what we showed in that panel. So here's just some data binding with some values from the data set we're using. So the accordion's got a content area and a header area. So we're using the kind of the session code as the header area. It allows us to specify CSS classes for both. So let's go ahead and data bind this to the same set of data. We'll just leave the grid view in place. That's fine. And we'll try something different here called hi. Better word than that. We'll go back to Silverlight. So now what you see here is you get this effect here. And now, so if you have, this is great for menus and whatnot, you get this kind of accordion functionality if you want to display a bunch of data. As well. So works great in another component without any code. We get this functionality. It's a data-bound control. Works just like all the other server controls that you're used to using. Sure I didn't forget any steps, and I didn't. So good. All right. So we have a large set of components in the toolkit. They all work very similar to what I just showed you. They're very easy to use. You can use them from the server side. You can also use the components from the client side. It takes a little more work, but the JavaScript that they're written in, you can pick up and use with PHP and Apache. If you want to, we have some users doing that as well. Our main scenario is targeting ASP.NET users, so you have to kind of do a little bit of fidgeting to get it to work, but it does work. There's no real dependencies there. So what we did after we started adding a bunch of components is we wanted to really figure out some ways to add some great value to the toolkit that people could leverage in their websites. So one of the things that we added was this general purpose animation framework for doing animations on your website. It's flexible, it's client side, it works on all the browsers. We've got a whole suite of basic animations to changing any style on your components, the location of your components, the opacity of your components. So it's very flexible. And you can use it either from XML on the ASPX page, or you can use it from the client side. And so what we're trying to do is add this animation functionality to all the components. I'll show you an example in a second, but you get to define the animations that happen. So versus us hard coding that something moves or collapses, that you can actually define those animations yourself, and we'll show an example of that in a second. The other thing we did, our early builds, we only had just the same JavaScript that I showed you in the project. Had comments in it. We try to be verbose with our comments in the code, but it creates larger JavaScript. So now we have some functionality in the toolkit that optimizes the JavaScript automatically. So we've decided to take a little bit of a different route with this than the ASP.NET AJAX team took. The way that they took it is that they define a bit in the script manager that declares whether or not the script that goes out is debug or retail. Because we ship with source and our stuff is rebuildable, we went a different route. Essentially, if you want to do retail, you basically either download our retail package, which has retail in it, or you just simply rebuild the toolkit. And if you build it in debug mode, you get debug scripts. If you build it in retail mode, you get retail scripts. So it works that way, makes the size of the DLL smaller, and makes the size of the download package smaller as well. One thing to remember when you're doing JavaScript with ASP.NET AJAX is if you're looking and seeing the size of the JavaScript in the client browser, that's not as much as is going over the wire. ASP.NET AJAX also supports gzip, so what happens is that it actually compresses the script, sends it over the wire to the browser, and all the browsers that we support gzip, and then it gets unpacked on the other side. So there's not as much as you think going across the wire, even as what shows in like Fiddler or something like that. So we'll show JavaScript optimization in a second. Generally, our scripts shrink by about 50% when you get rid of white space and comments. We've added some more functionality lately to really make the toolkit usable around the world. We've added a framework for 14 different languages. So we have our basic strings in all these languages. We're definitely looking for folks to help us add more languages, help us build out the strings. It turns out there's very few string constants in the toolkit, so our resource file has only got a few entries in it, but we have a good starting point there. As usual, English is the default kind of invariant language, and we basically do languages by popular demand. So we're welcoming people to help us with translations for other strings. Standards compliance. We've tried our best to be standards compliant. We're cross-browser. The only place that we're not cross-browser is where kind of browser limitations prevent it. So there are some things, I think we may have actually addressed all of them, but there are certain areas of functionality that Opera doesn't support very well, and we're limited by the support that ASP.NET AJAX has, I think around some of their script parsing. But for the most part, wherever we can support things, we do. Everything works in Firefox, Safari, and both versions of Internet Explorer 6 and 7. We're making sure we get all our XHTML issues taken care of. I think this slide might be a little older. I think we may have gotten all these issues ironed out. But again, if you find them, please log them and we'll get them fixed. And then we've also been trying to get accessibility into the toolkit, not only into our components, but helping people write accessible components as well. It turns out that accessibility for client applications like Windows is pretty well defined, what interfaces you have to support, what kind of scenarios, you have high contrast, people that are using different types of pointing devices, et cetera. On the web with AJAX, it's still kind of an evolving set of standards and set of kind of guidelines of how to make your website accessible. So we've done what we can to kind of make the toolkit follow along with the guidelines that are currently out there, and we're actually trying to drive some more agreement across Microsoft about how AJAX components should be accessible and how to make that usable by a broader set of users. So then the other side of the component toolkit is the AJAX toolkit is for basic component development. So what's happened with a lot of our users is they're not necessarily writing components that they're putting on their website for other people to consume. It turns out if you use the word component loosely, the toolkit is a really convenient way to bundle up any JavaScript that you're using on a regular basis and have it in a nice source code controlled way that you can easily apply to multiple web pages. Some of our toolkit components, there's one called confirm button that I showed you the page for in the sample website. It's really simple. It's just doing a window.confirm. But even then, it's nice to have that code in one place. So if you do want to change or to modify, you've got one place to go to, and you can easily kind of use it throughout your website. So obviously, as things become more complex, that becomes more useful. But we've seen a lot of people take a script that they use throughout their website and bundle it up into components just so that they can kind of manage it and use it more flexibly. One of the things that we've really tried to do when doing our component development is make sure that we don't introduce concepts that conflict with the concepts of the underlying AJAX framework. So the set of concepts you learn with the toolkit are completely complementary, and we use ASP.NET AJAX techniques wherever possible. And then if you do want to do some component development, we've got source code. My team is very active on the forums on AJAX or on forums.asp.net. Two of my team members, Kirti and David, have blogs. I have a blog. So we're trying to be really proactive about supporting the toolkit if you do want to do some component development. And some people have done some really exciting things. And if you are really getting into toolkit development, let us know, and we'll talk about actually making you into a contributor on the toolkit as well. So let's take a look at some of these productivity enhancements with the toolkit. OK, so the first thing we're going to do here, I mentioned the animation package. Let's look at how we can leverage that in the website that we've been building. So there's a component I mentioned earlier sitting on the page here called the update panel. And one of the extenders we have is called the update panel extender, or update panel animation. What this does is animates the update panel. So we'll go down here to our components. Here's the update panel animation extender. And as always, the thing we want to do here is set its target control ID. It's called update panel 1. Now I mentioned that we don't define animations by default. We allow the users to define these as well. And what we have is a very simple markup framework for defining animations in XML. So let's go ahead and add a simple animation here. Make sure I'm in the right place. So this is our animations tag here. And what it says, it's not in the schema, so we do get a squiggly here. But what this basically says is when the update panel is updating, we want to do an animation operation. And then when it's done updated, we want to do a different animation. And what we're going to do here is we're going to fade this thing out with some opacity, and we're going to fade it back in. So let's take a quick look at how that ends up looking. So you notice there it fades out, and when it's done, it fades back in. So every time we do an update, web, you see that it fades out, and it fades back in. So kind of an effect there to let your users have a little bit more context about what's going on with your website. But let's do something a little more interesting even. So I mentioned that these are very generic. So what we can do here is actually replace these with a more complex animation. So one of the structures that the animation framework supplies is called parallel, and parallel means to run all the child animations in parallel. We have one called sequential as well. And you can nest these, so you can create very kind of sophisticated effects here as well, and I'll show you an example of that on the animation page. Once you start to kind of put these together, people are amazed that it's just JavaScript. So if we click here, you'll see here that we get a more compound effect here of that thing flying out, and then when we close it, it goes away. So you see that again. So that's kind of an example of how complex we can make these. So back to our example here, what we're going to do is we're going to resize the update panel to 125. We're going to fade it out, and then on the way back in, we're going to do the opposite. So go ahead and push that in. And one of the features that we have here is some things that we want to compute dynamically. So we do have an ability in the animation framework to actually put a little bit of script in there so it can get its value dynamically. So in this case, we don't know how big the grid view is going to be because we don't know how many, or how big the panel is going to be because we don't know how many elements are in there. So we're actually going to ask it, hey, how big are you, so we know how big to resize it when we're done. So let's take a look at that. So you see here it kind of goes away, and I set it to be 125 high, so that's why you're seeing part of the top there. But you can generally use this to be creative about how you want your animations to work. So actually, it's a little easier to see this. Let's do one thing really quick. Add a little bit of a pause. One of the reasons that's so choppy is because our code's too fast. So let's add a little bit of a pause here to simulate some latency. I'd recommend not doing this in your websites. So that's the idea there. We could change that value so we don't get a little bit of it showing there, but that's the general idea. It's very flexible, and it's a lot of fun. So that's one side of it, and we also talked about component development. So let's take a look at what it looks like to develop a simple component using the toolkit. So I mentioned we have templates. So to this project, I can add a new project. You see down here in the bottom, I get this ASP.NET AJAX control project template that allows me to kind of easily create a new component. We're going to call this submit disable. So what this does is this creates me a project now with 3 elements in it. And again, this is a little small here, but we'll look at the code. First, it creates a JavaScript file. This is called submit disable behavior. We talked about behaviors and extenders. Extender is the server side. It's the part that allows you to hook up to a server-side element. Behavior is the client side, the actual functionality that lives in the client in JavaScript. So what we have here is a nice, strongly structured file we automatically create. We set up all the names for you, and it kind of allows you to do really component-like development with JavaScript. What we have here is the constructor. This is going to run when the behavior first gets created. What we have here is an initialize function. This is kind of after it's up and running. If we want to set some page state or read some page state, this is the right place for us to do that. We've got a nice dispose method, so we can do some cleanup. If you're doing components that are going to be inside of update panels, and you kind of never know if they are, you want to make sure in here you unhook any event handlers so you don't leave references laying around. You'll get really bizarre behavior if you forget to do that. And then down here at the bottom, we have a couple of property accessors, and we'll dig into what those are about more in a second. A designer file also gets created. That's so that we have a good design time experience, but you usually never have to mess with that at all. The extender piece on the server side mirrors what we had on the client side. So basically what gets created here is an extender, and this derives from extender control base, which derives from extender control, which is a class that lives in the ASP.NET AJAX. And we've defined this my property here, and it's a string valued property. So we have these kind of helper functions here for getting and setting the values, so you don't need to worry about declaring a variable or whatnot. And then we have this little piece of metadata here called extender control property. So the extender side of the toolkit is completely driven by metadata. So you can set, this tells the toolkit that this is actually a property that we want to send the value over to the client side with. We've got other metadata attributes that tell the toolkit things like that this property value is actually the name of another component on the page. So if you remember when we did the modal pop-up example, we had to specify a panel and a couple of buttons. So we'll actually say, oh, link button 1, that's on the page somewhere. And it goes and finds it, because if you've ever looked at the generated markup from ASP.NET, the names get like control00 underscore $, they get really complex. So if you add the ID, it's called the ID reference attribute, we'll automatically switch those out for you so it works on the client side. So we've got a set of attributes like that that really help you customize your behavior. We have them all documented on the website there. So in this case, we're going to change this one. The default is called my property. And we're just going to change it to call disabled text. Call it disabled text. What we're building here is a component that when you hit the search button, imagine you've got like a pay button or a submit button on your website. You don't want users to click it twice. You want it to go disabled when they click it, and then that way they don't actually hit it twice and get charged twice and call your customer support and everything else. So we're just going to replace that word my property with disabled text. So now we have a string property. We have a default value. Quick note on default value. This doesn't set the default value. This allows the framework to recognize a default value. What this means is if the value of this property is quote, quote, we're not going to bother sending it over to the client side. So that's what this does. It just marks it as being, that's what the default is, just so that we can be really smart about how much we send over the wire. Another thing we can do here is there's this target control type attribute here at the top. This defines what kinds of components it's valid to attach this extender to. So if you use this extender in the design time experience, we'll actually limit the components that show up in the list to these types. So we want to make this one only valid for iButton control things. That's all it takes to do that. So we're done actually with this now. So we have our server-side piece. We can code against it. Works great. Sure. So we build that. Now on the client side, we're going to essentially do the same operation as the client side. We're going to rename my property to the same value. So we're going to change it to disabled text. And then what this also did is it changed for us the member variable here. So when the user clicks the button, what we want to do is disable the button, and we want to change the button's text to be that disabled text. We can say, please wait, or don't click this again, or whatever we want. So let's go ahead and add that script code. So this is pretty basic script. This is where we change the value of the button. There's this call here called getElement. This is a very common call you're going to use. What getElement does is it says, get me a reference to the element I'm attached to. So in this case, we're going to attach this extender to an iButton control, a search button, or a link button. And what getElement is going to do is get you the client-side element, the input tag or whatever that you can code against. So that's pretty common. We're going to set its value, and for a button, the value is the text. A little bit of a wrinkle here. We have this set timeout. The reason we can't just say e.disabled equals true is I discovered that actually stops the submit. So if as part of the click you disable the button, the submit will never go through. So we use this method called set timeout, which is essentially it's going to wait 10 milliseconds and then disable the button. That allows the kind of code for the submit to happen, and then this will come around and disable it. So that's why that is that way. So we're going to go ahead and hook this up now. And one of the methods that ASP.NET AJAX defines is called addHandler, and this is a helper for hooking up events on the client side. We're going to hook the event to the button itself, so we'll use this.getElement again. And then we want this is the event we want to hook up to is click. If you've ever done any JavaScript programming, you know that the events are called usually onClick or onLoad. ASP.NET AJAX knows this, and this is one of the great things it does to help you deal with cross-browser functionality issues, because it turns out not all browsers use onClick. Some of them use click, and some of them use onClick. There is an abstraction layer within ASP.NET AJAX that says, oh, you're on Safari, oh, you're on Firefox. It deals with a bunch of these issues. So that's why you use this addHandler. It turns out event hooking up and unhooking is like one of the most difficult things cross-browser. ASP.NET AJAX handles that for you just like this. So you just type click, and you'll always get it right. And then we do something here called a delegate. And what this does, because we're in the context of an object here, we want to make sure when the button click happens that we can do things like this. And if we just were to say onClick, when we called this function, it would be called directly from the element itself, like the button element, and we wouldn't be able to say this because the context would be lost. So we have this thing called createDelegate, which actually makes sure it sets up the context right so we can use the this keyword inside the element. It finds this instance and stuff like that. So that's all the code we need to write. So now the other thing to do is go ahead and build this out, make sure I didn't cause any compile errors. And one of the things, if we go back to the ASPX page and find our button, it's right here. Let's add our extender next to it. Extenders don't need to sit right next to the component they're extending, but it's a good idea. If you're ever doing a page that has container controls in it, like a login view or a grid view, the extender does need to be in the same naming scope as the component's extending. ASP.NET developers haven't ever really encountered naming scope, but you'll notice that if you add an element, for example, inside of a login view, you no longer get the automatic member variable adding in the designer. That's because of the scope is different. So just putting them next to the thing you're extending is kind of a safe way to make sure that it can find the thing it's trying to extend. So in this case, when we built, Visual Studio Orca automatically added the element we just created here on the toolbox, so I can double click. And this is automatically going to add the reference to my other project. It's going to automatically generate the markup here for me, and I'm pretty much ready to go. So I'm going to, as always, hit the target control. Button 1. And then we have this function, this property called disabled text, and we'll say, hold it. Be nice to our users. So that's pretty much all we have to do. We've created a component. Let's go ahead and run this web page. So I hit search. See, now it disabled the button. It said hold it. Came back. The button got recreated. And it went back to its state. So now on every page in my entire website, I can use this extender. And I get the common functionality. It just took me a few minutes to write. It created, we ended up, this is a DLL project, so we ended up with a little assembly. Oops, that was the wrong button. Oh no, object browser. Or properties or something, okay. That's the one I wanted. So we ended up creating an assembly here. So, if you're going to be doing this, I'd recommend you put all of your components in a single assembly so you're not having a million of these things running around. But that's pretty simple, and you've created it there. So just to prove that I kind of wasn't kidding about where this works, let's go ahead and try this in Opera. Opera is interesting because one of their goals was to Okay, we won't do it that way. I seem to have lost Opera. Let's do it this way. One of the interesting things about Opera is that it, I don't know where my Opera went. We'll try Firefox instead. It does work in Opera. I don't know why my Opera disappeared. One of these things about Opera is that they try really hard to be super standards compliant, but on the other hand, there's just a bunch of stuff they don't support. So in some ways it's good, some ways it's less good. One thing I'm going to do with Firefox, though, is that I'm going to change this. This is something we're still trying to figure out. If anybody knows, let me know it. For some reason, when you go at Firefox with localhost instead of the localhost address, it's really slow to resolve localhost. And it's kind of something we started seeing on Vista, and we're not really sure what happens there. But so we get our completion there. We hit search. We get the fade out effect. Comes back. We get this. This works great. Down here at the bottom, we have our details with that. So works in Firefox. Works in Opera. I could show it to you. And that's all the functionality. So Toolkit in the future. We have about 14 non-Microsoft contributors. They're responsible for several of the controls. The validator pop-out was one, or pop-up. The first thing I showed you was a control from our users. We have a calendar control. It's from an external contributor. We have tab controls. Lots of them. They've also done some work on the other components. One of the things that we've encountered with Codeplex is that we can either make you a contributor to Codeplex and you have full rights or not, and there's kind of no middle ground. So we haven't had a way that's really lightweight for folks like yourselves that are using the toolkit that maybe fix a bug to submit a bug fix that we can pick up and easily, apply to the toolkit. We actually have a solution for this now. It's called the patching tool. So if you go up to our Codeplex site, you can download it. It's a very simple tool that allows you to make changes to your toolkit project. Push a button. It'll create a patch for us, and you can attach it to the bug report. We'll be able to easily apply your fix. It's good for us because we get a fix. It's good for you because then you don't have to reapply the fix every time we release. So we're definitely encouraging people to go ahead and do that. It's super easy to use. It's a click once Windows Forms app. Quick click, Comes right up on your site or on your machine, assuming you're running the .NET Framework, which if you're running Visual Studio, you probably are. We're continuing to work on accessibility, localization, other features to kind of round out the functionality as well as other components. And as ASP.NET, AJAX continues to evolve the toolkit as well. We're committed to kind of keeping it a really vibrant part. It's become a super important part of the overall ASP.NET AJAX story, so we want to make sure we keep that momentum. Looking for more information, you can go up to Codeplex. You can go up to the ASP.NET forums. We have a toolkit forum there as well. Like I said, my team's very active on that forum. We've got some great users that have really started to take charge and answer questions and are becoming very helpful. My blog here, msdn.com /burke, as well as my email address if you have other questions. And that's pretty much it. So I think we've got some time for questions. Please fill out your evaluation. And then that's it. Thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show.